I work at a decommissioned submarine station. Strange things happen here. They told me the station had been decommissioned. That was the word they used. Decommissioned. Like it was a broken vending machine or a mothballed museum ship left to rot at dock. But the moment I stepped out of the boat and onto that wet steel platform, rust bleeding from every seam, gulls circling but never landing, the air dense with a coppery stillness, I knew the term didn't fit. You don't decommission a place that still breathes. And make no mistake, the station was still breathing. I could feel it under my boots, a slow rhythmic hum that pulsed through the floor panels and up my legs like a memory trying to resurface. They said it was residual generator activity. They lied. I had been reassigned there after an incident on a carrier in the Baltic. A sonar malfunction that wasn't a malfunction, readings that didn't make sense, and a superior who vanished from the logs a week after I filed my report. I was told it was stress-related delusion. Officially. Unofficially, they needed someone familiar with what they called legacy systems. Someone they could tuck away without making noise. The station was located off a stretch of jagged coastline that didn't show up on civilian maps. It was built during the Cold War, back when paranoia justified concrete and steel poured into the sea like it was infinite. You wouldn't see it from above. You'd barely notice it on sonar unless you knew where to look, and even then, the readings were distorted. I arrived at dusk. The light bent wrong around the water, like the sun was being filtered through something denser than atmosphere. The boat that brought me didn't linger. No welcome, no instructions. Just a clipboard with my name and an old-fashioned metal key. The door was already open. Inside, the corridors were narrow and low, built for function, not comfort. The walls were sweating condensation, the kind that tasted metallic if it dripped on your lip. There were still markings in faded Cyrillic under the English overlays. No one had bothered to repaint them. I found the control room by following the thrum in the floor. It was like following a distant heartbeat. Slow and stubborn. The equipment was older than I was, but most of it was still running. Analog dials twitched softly in their glass domes. Oscilloscopes blinked like the eyes of sleeping dogs. A single monitor in the corner glowed a sickly green, its cursor blinking like it had been waiting for someone for a long, long time. There was no one else in the station. That was the first thing I confirmed. I did a full sweep. Sleep quarters, galley, storage, auxiliary. No personnel. Just sealed rooms, some filled with dust-covered furniture. Others completely empty except for strange scorch marks on the floor. One of them had what looked like an outline, as if something had been incinerated cleanly out of existence. The smell in that room didn't leave my clothes for 3 days. I reported back via the encrypted satellite uplink. A brief status update. No reply. No confirmation of receipt. Just static, and once, what sounded like a click. Like someone picking up on the other end, then hanging up without speaking. I settled into routine. Ran diagnostic checks, logged daily vitals, inspected the hull integrity. Everything was technically within tolerances, though some of the data didn't line up with the blueprints I had been given. The structural map said there were 12 compartments on level 3. I found 13. The 13th door had no markings, no handle, just a vertical seam. When I leaned close, I could hear something faint behind it. Not machinery, not water. Breathing. On my third night, I stopped hearing the gulls. Not that they were ever loud, more like background static. But there was something jarring about their sudden absence. I climbed to the top of the antenna tower, which had a narrow access shaft barely wide enough for my shoulders. From there, I could see the ocean in every direction. Flat, black, still. I couldn't even hear the waves, though I could see them lapping against the platform far below. It was like the water had been muted. That night, something moved in the lower halls. I didn't see it directly. I caught it on the edge of the closed-circuit monitors. A flicker in the hallway outside the storage bay. Too quick for definition, but unmistakable. It wasn't a rat. It wasn't a trick of light. There was a shadow where there shouldn't have been one. I replayed the footage a dozen times. On the final playback, the monitor glitched, and for exactly 1 frame, the image changed. I saw what looked like a person. Naked, pale, crouched low to the floor like an animal. The face was wrong. Not distorted. Just off. Like a mask sculpted from memory, rather than observation. I paused the frame and stared. The eyes were black. Not empty. Not absent. Full. full of something that watched back. I blinked, and the frame was gone, replaced by static. The recording didn't save. I left the control room and went to the spot I'd seen on the screen. Nothing. No prints, no signs of entry. But the air was colder there, the kind of cold that sinks into your spine and makes your bones ache. I spent the next hour double-checking the station logs. Power draw, internal pressure, oxygen consumption. One of the auxiliary tanks had been drawn from. 3% unaccounted for. I wasn't using it. I logged the anomaly. 2 hours later, the entry had been deleted. I didn't delete it. The system has no network connection, no external access. I began keeping handwritten notes, pages that I folded and hid in different compartments around the station, in case something started rewriting the logs again, in case I needed to remember what was real. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the control room with all the lights on, listening to the distant creaks of the structure, the groans of metal stressed by time and pressure. Just before dawn, the lights flickered. Once, then again. The backup battery kicked in immediately, but the station dimmed. Just a heartbeat slower, just long enough to make my skin crawl. That's when I noticed the screen again, the sickly green one with the blinking cursor. Only now it wasn't blinking. It was typing. One word. Over and over. Listen. I pulled the plug. The screen stayed on. The screen eventually turned black, not from anything I did, but seemingly by its own accord, like an exhausted eye finally closing after hours of staring. I sat frozen, watching the dull glass for movement, for another word, for the blinking cursor to return and continue its command. But nothing happened. Just silence, thick and syrupy, pressing against my eardrums like I'd been dropped into the deepest trench of the ocean. I left the control room with the intention of resetting the station's main circuit relays, which were located 2 levels down in the equipment core. I told myself it was a practical decision, a standard systems check after a voltage anomaly. But in truth, I needed to get away from that screen. Something about the way the word was typed, listen, over and over, like it was screaming at me through the keys, made it feel less like a glitch and more like a presence. Something insistent. Something sentient. I descended the narrow ladder to level 4, my flashlight cutting across the riveted walls as droplets of condensation trickled down like sweat on skin. The deeper levels of the station always felt denser, like the water pressure outside wasn't fully kept at bay, like the ocean's weight had seeped in and embedded itself in the metal. As I reached the corridor that led to the equipment core, my foot caught on something unexpected, a length of heavy cable that hadn't been there before. It was coiled like a snake across the floor, leading into a passage I had never seen. A passage that, according to the schematics, didn't exist. The new corridor was colder. The air bit at my cheeks even though the station maintained a standard temperature. I followed the cable with measured steps, hand brushing the wall for balance. The surfaces here were different, rougher, older. Not like the concrete and steel finish of the rest of the facility. These walls were bare iron, oxidized and grooved with indentations that felt almost organic, like someone had pressed their fingers into molten metal and let it harden around the print. I passed a grated vent that emitted a low, rhythmic wheeze. Not mechanical. Breathing. At the end of the corridor stood a door. Not a hatch, not a bulkhead. An actual door, made of decayed wood that looked centuries out of place. No handle, only a circular brass porthole at eye level, completely fogged from within. I leaned forward. My breath clouded the glass. Something moved on the other side. I don't remember opening the door. One moment I was outside, and the next I was stepping over the threshold, drawn in by something between a whisper and a hum. The room inside was wrong. That's the only word I've ever been able to use. It was shaped like an amphitheater, descending in concentric rings toward a pool of dark liquid at the center. The walls were covered in what I thought were carvings, rows and rows of alien-looking symbols, etched with maddening precision. But when I got closer, I realized they weren't carvings. They were etched from the inside of the wall, as if the material had grown around the letters. The pool pulsed. Not with light, but with motion, like it had its own tide. I stared into it, and for a few terrible seconds, I couldn't remember where I was. Not the room, not the station, not even my own name. My mind went blank, wiped clean like a chalkboard under a wet rag. Then I blinked, and I was me again. But the terror of that moment lingered, sticky and permanent. As I turned to leave, I saw the figure. It was seated on the far side of the chamber, so still I had mistaken it for a piece of equipment. Humanoid in shape but elongated, limbs too thin and neck too long. Its head was bowed as though asleep, but I had the unmistakable sense that it was listening. To me, to my heartbeat, to my thoughts. The moment I took a step back, its head twitched slightly. Not raised, just angled, acknowledging. That was enough. I ran. I didn't look back until I reached the control room and slammed the door behind me. The lights flickered again, this time in rhythmic patterns like Morse code. I didn't know Morse, but it didn't matter. I wasn't going to decode messages from a room that shouldn't exist. I tried to call for extraction. I used the encrypted sat link, static. Then a voice, barely audible. You found it. Then more static. No identification, no confirmation, just that. You found it. I unplugged the system. For the next few hours, I locked myself in the supply room and went through the station blueprints again. I traced every hallway, every level, every access shaft. The corridor I had found wasn't on any of them, but something else caught my eye. A note in fine print, buried in a footnote under Level 4. Section 3B sealed per Directive, 74 Alpha, 1987, access denied. There was no Section 3B. I began noticing more discrepancies. The oxygen levels were slightly elevated, despite no one else being present. The motion sensors in the access tunnel registered movement at intervals that didn't match my own. Sometimes I'd return to the galley to find utensils moved or drawers slightly open. I chalked it up to paranoia, until the third night, when I found a handwritten note in my bunk. Different handwriting, different ink. Just 3 words. It remembers you. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The station creaked more loudly at night, as if something were walking the hallways with careful, deliberate steps. Always behind the wall, always just out of reach. I took to carrying a sidearm even within the station, even during maintenance tasks. I didn't feel safe without it. Not because I thought I'd have to shoot something, but because I needed to believe I could. One morning I opened the main access hatch to check the dock, and something was waiting in the water. It wasn't a boat. It wasn't human. Just beneath the surface, barely visible in the murky light, was a face. Not floating. Watching. The eyes were open. They didn't blink. They didn't belong to a corpse. They belonged to something that had been here long before the station was built. I shut the hatch. I decided then that I would leave. Abandon post. Use the emergency raft. Send out an SOS. Take my chances with the court-martial. But when I got to the escape bay, the raft was gone. Not deployed. Gone. As if it had never been mounted there to begin with. And in its place, on the wall, was a smear of dark liquid that hadn't been there the day before. It ran in streaks down the steel, forming what I swore looked like symbols. The same kind etched into the walls of the room that didn't exist. I backed away. I didn't touch it. Back in the control room, the screen was on again. The cursor was blinking. The word had changed. Now it said, "Open." And for the first time, I realized it wasn't a command. It was an invitation. The word lingered there. Open. Like a suggestion delivered through gritted teeth. Like a door barely ajar that only needed the slightest nudge to unhinge. I stared at it for what felt like hours, not daring to touch the keyboard. I didn't want to see what would happen if I acknowledged it. And yet, ignoring it made me feel complicit. Like I was allowing something to fester by choosing inaction. I tried to pull myself away from the terminal, but a part of me remained tethered to that screen, to that one word, as if I'd already said yes without realizing. I slept briefly that night, in the storage room with my back against the locked door, and a fire extinguisher cradled in my arms like a relic from a war I never signed up to fight. Every sound was a whisper. Every vibration in the pipes felt like movement from another floor. But no alarms were triggered. No breaches. Just silence broken by irregular shudders in the hull, like the sea itself was breathing. The next day, I forced myself to do what I was originally sent there for. Inspection reports, system checks, inventory updates. Anything to occupy my mind and pretend I was a rational man doing a rational job. But the moment I passed the corridor near Level 4 again, the one that shouldn't have existed, I felt that humming again. Low, droning, like an ancient frequency barely scraping the limits of hearing. It wasn't a sound in the air. It was in my bones, vibrating subtly through marrow. The longer I stood there, the more I could feel my heartbeat begin to synchronize with it. I turned away before I lost time again, like I had in that room. But as I stepped back into the main corridor, something else changed. The walls felt different, like the station had expanded by a few inches overnight, and I hadn't noticed until that very moment. A subtle wrongness, impossible to point to directly, but impossible to dismiss. I checked the blueprints again later that evening, measured the lengths of the corridor with a laser meter, took note of every bulkhead, every welded seam. I recorded the distance, then did it again 6 hours later. The numbers didn't match. The corridor had grown. Less than a meter, but enough to register, enough to prove that space was shifting. The station was warping around itself, silently, invisibly, as if being folded from the inside by a force that didn't believe in physics as we knew it. That night, I sealed the Level 4 corridor with an emergency barrier and activated lockdown protocols, something that hadn't been done since the Cold War. The alarms didn't go off. The system didn't acknowledge my command. But when I went back to look at the corridor, the seal was in place, as if something else had listened, something watching, silently agreeing. I didn't find comfort in that. I began dreaming. At least, I thought they were dreams. I'd blink out for a second while reading a technical manual, and suddenly I was underwater, surrounded by rusting submarines drifting through a black abyss. Their hulls were split open like rib cages, releasing streams of bubbles that sounded like whispers. I wasn't drowning. I was breathing just fine. But I wasn't human either. I had no body. I was just presence, floating, and the sea was infinite. Then I'd wake, and seconds had passed. But sometimes, I'd come to and hours had gone. One afternoon, I blacked out in the reactor room and woke up at the far end of the station near the antenna mast, my boots soaked in salt water, with no memory of walking there. The hatch had never opened. There were no footprints. One evening, while making a desperate attempt to calibrate the radar dish, an excuse to climb the comms tower and get as far from the belly of the station as possible, I noticed the sea was unusually still. No tide, no wind, no spray. The surface was like polished glass, and beneath it, I could see the shapes again. Not fish, not marine life, but outlines, tall, thin silhouettes that stood unmoving on the ocean floor like monuments. There were at least 12 of them, evenly spaced, facing upward toward the surface, as though waiting. The sonar had recorded nothing. I ran diagnostics 3 times, but when I tried to ping the coordinates manually, the system returned a line of corrupted data and rebooted itself. I didn't try again. The screen in the control room now displayed different words every time I walked by. I never touched the keys, but it reacted to my presence. First it said listen again, then open, then another. Remember. That one scared me the most, because I didn't know what it referred to. I'd started forgetting things. Small things. The names of modules in the station I'd worked in for years. What I had eaten the day before. Sometimes I'd find logs I didn't remember writing, with my own signature, but in a tone that didn't sound like me. One was a system report claiming the reactor had entered a dormant state, but when I checked the reactor room, it was running hotter than usual, pulsing with a low red glow I hadn't seen before. I recorded the thermal output. It exceeded safety limits by 17%. But there was no alarm, no shutdown protocol. Just a deep, continuous hum that echoed down the pipes and into the marrow of the walls. The worst came 3 nights later. I was asleep, truly asleep for once, medicated and exhausted, when I awoke to the sensation of being watched. Not paranoia, not imagination, actual breath on my cheek. I sat up in the dark, heart pounding, and shone my flashlight. Nothing. But my bunk had moved 4 inches from the wall, and the hatch to my cabin was ajar. I always locked it. Always. In the hallway, the lights flickered in a rhythmic pattern. I realized it wasn't random. The timing matched the sonar pings from the old days, the pattern used for long-range Morse identification. I began transcribing it, against my better judgment. When I finished, the message was simple. Below you. I didn't sleep after that. I started wiring cameras in every hallway, installing makeshift alarms made from tools and bits of string. It was useless. Whatever was here, it didn't obey movement sensors or pressure pads. It slipped between gaps in reality, moving not just through space but around it, like water through porous stone. I spoke aloud sometimes. just to feel human, just to hear my own voice bounce off the walls and confirm I still existed. But even that felt risky. I was beginning to suspect that anything I said, anything I thought was heard. Not by microphones or surveillance tech, but by the station itself, or the thing that had nested inside it. I found another note under my bunk. This one was damp, like it had been pulled from the ocean. The ink was smeared but readable. It said, "You've been here before." My hands shook. I knew I hadn't. This was my first assignment to this sector, my first deployment to this station. But I started searching records, old logs, previous crew rotations. The files were missing, redacted. And then, in a backup folder I didn't remember creating, I found a manifest from 2003, 20 years ago, listing a crew of 6. One of the names was mine. The file had no accompanying photo, no rank, no notes, just my name. Spelled exactly the same. Middle initial correct. Blood ran cold in my veins. I checked the medical bay, which had been dormant since I arrived. Inside a locked cabinet, behind a wall panel, I found 6 vials of preserved blood samples, each labeled with an ID code matching the 2003 manifest. One of them had my name. I scanned it. It matched my current biometrics, identical in every way. I wasn't sure what terrified me more, that someone had copied me, or that I had somehow been here before and erased the memory. Either way, the station knew, and it was beginning to let me remember. There is a kind of fear that doesn't strike like lightning, doesn't scream in your face or announce itself with blood and chaos, but rather leaks slowly, like a silent gas, seeping into every corner of your awareness until even the act of breathing feels suspect. That was the kind of fear that began to settle into me after I found my name on the 2003 manifest and held that vial of my own blood in shaking hands, knowing with absolute certainty that I had never, to my memory, been stationed here before. Yet everything in that sealed drawer, everything in the backup logs and the perfectly matched biometrics said otherwise. I should have left then. I should have signaled the mainland, activated the emergency evac protocols, or even taken the rubber raft stored on the upper deck and drifted for days if necessary. But the truth was, I didn't trust the water anymore. I didn't trust anything that moved in it. And the idea of floating above those statues on the seabed, the ones that had turned to look at me in the reflection of the control tower's glass, was worse than staying inside this cursed skeleton of steel and humming circuits. So I stayed, and I started digging. Not literally, not at first. I scoured every terminal, pulled every hard drive, accessed archives buried so deep in the system I'm sure even the Navy had forgotten they existed. And the deeper I went, the more I found records that didn't match anything in public databases, rotations that never appeared in deployment orders, transcripts of radio conversations between command and someone logged under my name, requesting reassessment of psychological anomalies, notes about temporal disruptions and loop integrity, phrases that felt like science fiction, until I realized that these documents were signed, time-stamped, and classified under black-level clearance, far above anything I'd ever seen in my years of service. One particular document chilled me to the marrow. It was titled, Subject 6, Retention Stability Report. The report detailed a man whose memories degraded slowly with each rotation, requiring subtle environmental triggers to recover fragments of his identity. The profile matched me, down to the scar on my left hand, a scar I'd always thought came from childhood, a bike accident. But now I wasn't so sure. The document ended with the phrase, "Observation continues. Do not initiate breach protocol unless presence reaches cognitive awakening threshold." I was the subject. Not a technician, not a lieutenant. I was the experiment. And the station, this twisted, sunken relic of the Cold War, was my containment unit. Or worse, my caretaker. I started testing the boundaries. I tried to stay awake for over 48 hours, reasoning that if I was losing time in sleep, then denying sleep might stabilize my mind. But even in waking, I began to slip. I'd look at my hands and not recognize them. I'd find notes written in my own handwriting, scattered across the station. Some warnings, some apologies, some complete nonsense. One read, "Don't eat the canned pears," while another simply said, "He's learning your walk." I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirror near the latrine, and for a split second, my mouth moved out of sync with my thoughts. I stared, unmoving, as my reflection smirked. Just barely. just long enough for doubt to sink its teeth into my sense of self and twist. On the third night without sleep, I heard footsteps on level 2. Heavy, deliberate. Not the metallic echo of a rodent or loose tool falling, but boots. Human, or something mimicking the sound of humanity. I grabbed my flashlight and descended the stairwell in total silence, every hair on my neck rising as I turned each corner. When I reached the bottom, there was nothing. Just the thick smell of oxidized metal and the low hum of the backup generators. But as I turned to leave, I noticed the door to Lab 3 was ajar. That door had been sealed since before my arrival, welded shut from the outside. I approached, slow, almost unwilling. The weld lines were split clean, not torched, not cut, separated, as though the metal had decided to part on its own. Inside, the lab was pristine, dustless, no sign of the rust or decay that plagued the rest of the station. On the far wall was a bank of monitors, all displaying the same frozen image. Me, sitting at the terminal in the control room, staring blankly at the screen. The timestamp was dated 2 days into the future. My heart seized. I checked again. The footage wasn't looped. The movements were subtle. Eye twitches, a tap of the finger. But it was real. A feed from a moment that hadn't happened yet. My hands trembled as I backed out of the room, but not before noticing something else on the table beside the monitors. A file folder labeled Reintegration Cycle 3, Status, Unstable. Back in my quarters, I locked the door and sat against the wall with the file open in my lap. Pages described behaviors I hadn't yet displayed. Aggression, auditory hallucinations, suicidal ideation. One note mentioned an event delta, a moment during which subject identity would collapse and merge with prior iterations, effectively ending the cycle. There was no detail on what happened next, just a blank space under the outcome section. I wanted to believe this was all a mistake, a fabrication, some elaborate psych warfare op that had gone too far. But when I looked at my reflection again, this time in the stainless steel of my bunk's frame, I saw my lips move without my consent. And this time, I heard them, whispering one word I didn't understand, but recognized with primal dread: abyssum. I began to notice that the sea no longer made sound, no waves, no creaking from pressure shifts. The station felt as if it were buried, not submerged, and I started to wonder if we were even in water anymore. The oxygen levels fluctuated. Gravity felt off, just slightly, like everything was lighter than it should be, as if I were inside a dream where the laws of physics had loosened. My boots didn't echo the same on the floor. Footsteps faded too quickly, and I kept catching glimpses of motion from the corner of my eye. Shapes moving in impossible directions, as though obeying a geometry I couldn't comprehend. I stopped trusting doors. Some opened to the wrong rooms. One time I opened a supply closet and found an ocean of darkness beyond it. Literal ocean, with fish drifting in open space as if gravity didn't apply. I slammed the door and reopened it moments later, and it was shelves again. Rations, tools, as if nothing had changed. But I knew better. The boundaries of the station were warping, not just in dimension, but in meaning. Rooms were no longer rooms. Time no longer strictly time. I found myself outside one night without memory of opening the hatch. Just standing barefoot on the rusted catwalk overlooking the still sea, the moon above me bloated and too close, casting an oily reflection across the surface. Below, the statues had moved. All of them. They were now arranged in a perfect circle, and in the center stood a new one. I didn't need light to see it. It had my face, my posture, my insignia. But it was not stone. It breathed. Slowly, methodically, as if waking from a dream. I turned and ran, back into the station, back into the narrowing hallways that felt unfamiliar and wrong. I passed the mirror in the maintenance corridor and saw not one reflection, but 3, each slightly out of phase, like time-lapsed exposures of myself, overlapping in conflict. My nose bled. I collapsed, dizzy, and saw the lights above flicker in a pattern I now understood without translation. Countdown, initiated. I don't know what's coming, but I know it's not evacuation. It's not rescue. The station is preparing for something, and I fear I am the signal, or the lock, or the key. I don't remember falling asleep, but I remember waking. Or rather, I remember the moment my awareness returned, as if it had been paused, spooled back, and replayed. I was lying on the floor of the communications room, cheek pressed against the cold metal grate, the distant hum of electricity vibrating in my molars. There was dried blood on my upper lip, a slow drip of something darker crusted beneath my nose, and I could smell copper and rust, and the stagnant sweat of machinery left to rot. The overhead lights had flickered into a static rhythm. Pulse, pause, pulse, pause, casting alternating slices of shadow and clarity across the room like a metronome for sanity. I sat up slowly, limbs stiff, bones aching with a weight that felt older than fatigue, and it took me several seconds to realize the pattern in the light wasn't random. It was Morse code. I counted the intervals, translated without thinking, as if the knowledge had always been there, dormant, waiting to surface. It spelled out a single word: deepen. The walls felt narrower than before. Not physically, though maybe that too, but perceptually, as if some presence were folding in around me, compressing the space in increments too subtle to fight against. I pushed open the hatch and staggered into the corridor, uncertain of how long I'd been unconscious, or what had happened while I was. I could no longer trust the internal clocks. They all read different times now, none of which matched the ones on the backup systems. Even my own watch spun idly, the second hand twitching like an insect caught under glass. I began to hear something distant, a rhythmic clang. Not mechanical, not entirely. More like a deliberate banging, metal against metal, slow, heavy, purposeful. It came from the lower levels, far beneath where the seawater line should have rendered the rooms inaccessible, and yet I knew the doors would open now. The station, or whatever lived inside it, wanted them open. I followed the sound down, descending the winding stairwell that wrapped through the belly of the station like a coiled spine. As I passed each level, the air grew heavier, thicker, as though infused with something more than oxygen, like memory or time itself had turned viscous. The walls wept condensation that tasted of salt and copper when I brushed my hand along them. I reached sub-level 4, a deck I had never accessed before, and yet my fingerprint opened the hatch without resistance. The lights flickered to life before I could touch the panel. It was waiting. Inside was a room unlike the others. No rust, no damage. The floor was tiled, sterile white and pristine, though something about the symmetry disturbed me. Too perfect. Too new. In the center of the room stood a single object. A deep-sea pressure suit, upright, suspended in a display case of glass that reflected nothing but void. The suit was old, older than the station possibly, but it looked untouched. Brass fixtures gleamed. The viewing port was darkened, almost black. I approached slowly, breath hitching with each step, because something about the suit triggered a reaction so deep I couldn't explain it. A tremor in the spine, a stutter in the pulse, like I'd seen it before, in a dream, or something worse. Etched on the glass was an inscription. I leaned closer, squinting to read it in the dim light. It said, Observer 1, return incomplete. Beneath it, a smaller line, awaiting host integrity confirmation. I stepped back, the floor too quiet beneath my boots, and I realized the banging had stopped. Silence fell in thick layers, pressing against my eardrums. I turned to leave, but my reflection in the case didn't move. Not immediately. It lagged by a fraction of a second, and when it caught up, it tilted its head slightly, as if acknowledging something I hadn't yet said aloud. Then the suit moved. Not a full motion, just a twitch. The fingers inside curled slightly against the glass. I froze. There was no one inside. I could see that clearly now. The visor was empty, the joints unoccupied, but something animated it, something unseen and patient. A hiss escaped from the valves on its back, the kind of release you hear just before descent into crushing depths. I stumbled backward, and the lights in the room pulsed, once, twice, then steadied. On instinct, I ran. Back up the stairs, 2 levels at a time, ignoring the burning in my calves and the taste of blood rising in my throat. As I emerged into the main corridor, I heard the sound again. Not the banging this time. Breathing. Deep, slow inhalations, amplified through metal. It followed me, not with footsteps, but with presence. Doors creaked open as I passed. Lights dimmed behind me. The station was no longer asleep. When I reached the control deck, I found the external cameras online, cycling through the views outside the hull. The seabed was unchanged, except for one detail. The statue with my face was gone. In its place stood the pressure suit, upright, motionless, facing the station. I flipped to the camera at the airlock. Nothing. Then again. Just static. A distortion. And then the suit, inside, somehow, standing in the entryway, dripping water that pooled at its feet but never spread. I don't remember opening the door. But it's here now. Not moving. Just observing. I sat down, knees shaking, and stared back at it. Its visor, still dark, began to shimmer faintly. And then, in the reflection, I saw something I cannot explain. Myself, but not. Older, hollow-eyed, wounded, speaking silently behind the glass. I leaned forward, heart pounding, and read the words on its lips. "You left me here." The lights surged. The camera feeds blinked out, and the room became unbearably quiet. I looked up again, and the suit was gone. No sound, no trace. Just a puddle of water that had already begun to evaporate, leaving behind salt lines like veins in the floor. I checked the internal security logs. No breach, no anomaly. The last recorded motion at the airlock had been dated 20 years ago, and the file was marked cleared. I opened it. The video showed a man entering the station in a pressure suit. Not walking, crawling, drenched, limping, broken. He dragged himself across the floor, collapsed at the threshold of the main corridor. The timestamp blurred as the footage progressed, skipping seconds, minutes, hours, until the image froze on the man's face. It was me. Not exactly, but close enough that denial was no longer an option. There were no further entries, just static. I began to hear the word again, abyssum, this time spoken through the speakers, distorted, low, stretched into a frequency that made my eyes water and my gums ache. The sound was not coming from the ocean. It was coming from beneath the floor. I lifted a panel. Beneath the grate, instead of wiring, I found a tunnel. Smooth, flesh-colored, pulsating slightly like the inside of a throat. I closed the panel and sat back, shaking. I don't think the station is a machine anymore. I think it's alive. I think it always was. And I think the suit was never meant to protect anyone from the pressure outside. It was meant to hold something inside. Something that needed a body, a host. Something that remembers. Something that waits. And it's not waiting anymore. It started with the vibrations again. Not sound, not exactly, but a low, resonant tremor that emanated from the steel walls themselves, humming through the rivets and support beams, settling deep into my molars like a hidden language gnawing through bone. I had tried to sleep, or at least pretend I could, lying motionless in the crew quarters, under a mothballed thermal blanket that smelled like oil and mildew, but rest was impossible. The room pulsed faintly with a warmth that hadn't existed yesterday, as if the temperature regulators were being overridden by something other than programming, something instinctual. I lay awake, eyes fixed on the cracked bulkhead above me, counting the intervals between each vibration, because that was all I could do to remind myself that time still passed in a linear fashion. 5 seconds, then 6, then 7, then nothing. The silence returned like a fist to the sternum. When I rose, the hallway outside was lit by a pale amber hue I didn't recognize, cast not by overhead lamps, but by something further down the corridor. The color didn't look artificial. It looked organic, like it had been secreted rather than emitted. As I walked toward it, my boots made no sound, as though the floor had been replaced by foam, or the station no longer wished to acknowledge my presence. The amber glow came from behind a sealed bulkhead marked Lower Dry Storage, a section long since flooded in the schematics, rendered inaccessible by structural collapse, according to every log I'd seen. Yet the door stood intact, unsealed, waiting. I pressed my hand against the panel, half expecting it to remain inert, but the hatch hissed and unlocked with a smoothness that felt practiced. Inside, the space was vast, hollowed out well beyond the architectural footprint. The floor sloped gently downward, the walls stripped of paint, bare metal scarred with grooves like claw marks or ancient script eroded by time. And at the center, resting on a platform of coiled piping and loose cables, was a shape I cannot accurately describe. A monolith not of stone, but of compressed matter, dark and fibrous, as if hundreds of wetsuits had been melted and molded into something resembling a seed or cocoon. It pulsed, slowly, like a breath. I stepped closer, irrationally calm, my brain firing warnings I no longer had the strength to heed. The cocoon's surface was warm to the touch, and as I brushed my fingers across it, a shock ran up my arm. Not electric, but mnemonic. I saw flashes. A man in a pressure suit sinking into black water. A metal room filled with whispering voices. An eye, large and irisless, staring through a porthole not from the outside, but from within the ship itself. I stumbled back, breath ragged, and the cocoon twitched. Not just pulsed, twitched. A sudden shift beneath the surface, as though something inside had stirred at my presence. Then came the echo. A distant metallic groan reverberated through the hull. Familiar, like the noise I'd heard on my first day, only deeper, more urgent. It didn't come from this chamber, but from somewhere above. I ran, not out of panic, but necessity. The kind that comes when you realize you've lingered too long in a place you were never meant to see. As I passed through the hatch, I glanced back and saw condensation forming on the cocoon's skin, gathering into rivulets that trickled upward, defying gravity. The amber light dimmed behind me, fading like a dying pulse. I made it back to the control deck, heart still pounding, only to find the monitors had changed. The camera feeds now cycled through rooms that shouldn't exist. Angled hallways with no doors, stairwells that looped endlessly downward, laboratories filled with identical instruments laid out in mirror image, as though two realities were beginning to overlap. And in one feed, standing motionless at the end of a corridor I'd never seen, was the man in the pressure suit. He didn't move, but the feed flickered each time I looked away, and when I returned to the screen, he was always closer. I shut off the monitors, but their glow remained in the reflection of the observation glass, even as the displays went dark. That was when the communications array buzzed to life, not with voices, but with a single sustained tone, low and warbling, like a sonar ping drawn out into a scream. The waveform danced across the spectrum, and within it, I began to hear a pattern. Not language, but memory. My voice. Recordings of me from logs I'd never made, recounting moments that hadn't yet happened. "Don't follow the light," one fragment said. "It's not trying to show you the way. It's trying to remember the way you die." Another, whispered and broken. "They're not echoes. They're rehearsals." I yanked the headset off, heart hammering. The walls felt closer now, the ceiling lower. I checked the station schematics again. The map had changed. Corridors rerouted themselves in real time, storage rooms vanished, and one particular section, level B7, had been relabeled from inactive to current. I tried to lock it out, to override whatever system glitch was causing it, but the station no longer accepted my inputs. Instead, a new prompt appeared. Reintegration requested. Confirm host presence. Below it, a countdown began. I didn't wait to see what would happen when it reached 0. I fled. But the station shifted around me. Doors that once led to familiar places now opened to stairwells I didn't recognize, and rooms I knew by heart had rearranged themselves subtly, just enough to disorient. The mess hall was now mirrored. The kitchen had no utensils. My own sleeping quarters no longer had a bed, just a drain in the floor and walls lined with handholds, as though preparing for water. I heard whispers again. Not in the air, but in the structure. The piping moaned like lungs. The support beams vibrated with overlapping syllables I couldn't translate. They weren't talking to me. They were practicing, repeating, rehearsing. Then came the worst discovery. I returned to the central archive, hoping to piece together any records that hadn't yet been corrupted, and found a file dated nearly 20 years prior, marked Subject Recovered, Partial Memory Retention. It was a personnel log, audio only, and it began with my name. Not someone who looked like me. Not someone with the same title. Me. Same voice. Same intonation. Talking about this station, this assignment, this descent into unreality. It was identical to the logs I had recorded over the past few weeks. Except this one ended with a scream and the words, "If you find this, you're already part of it." The file was time-stamped on the same day I'd arrived, only 2 decades earlier. I staggered back, nausea washing over me like seawater, and the walls pulsed again. The cocoon had not been the source. It had been a symptom. The real source was older, deeper, and it had already begun to awaken. I don't know how many versions of myself have walked these halls. I don't know whether I'm the first to resist or the latest to repeat, but I do know this. Something in the station is trying to reconstruct a memory it no longer possesses. It needs a template, a shape, a voice, and I fear it has chosen mine. I thought I had learned the pattern, understood the pulse of the station well enough to navigate it even as it bent its architecture against my memory. But as I moved through the corridors after the voice recordings, I began to suspect that the station no longer wanted to mislead me. It wanted to teach me, to initiate me. The walls pulsed with something like intent, as though each metallic panel had grown a quiet awareness. The lights flickered not at random but in a cadence, illuminating signs that had never existed before. White painted arrows with no text, pointing downward, always downward. I followed them, not because I trusted them, but because I was already too far past the threshold of sense to pretend that avoiding them meant safety. If anything, ignoring the signs had led to more confusion, more shifting spaces, more of those anomalies where time lost cohesion and my own memories turned unreliable. So I descended, level by level, to the belly of the station where the blueprints had once declared a reinforced ballast chamber, long since removed from operational use. The stairwell that took me there was not part of any schematic. It wound downward in tight angular spirals, the air growing warmer with every turn. The walls were etched, intentionally carved, into patterns I didn't recognize. Not language, not art, but rhythmic marks, as though a machine with a consciousness had tried to draw breath. The bottom opened into a chamber I can only describe as a library, but not in the traditional sense. There were no shelves, no books, no terminals, only stacks. Vertical columns of compressed material, paper, fiber, metal, bone, fused together into towers that pulsed with a low hum. The room was lit not by electricity, but by a ceiling of softly glowing panels that felt organic, like membrane stretched too thin over a source of bioluminescence. In the center of the room sat a figure, not a person, not quite. It looked human in proportion, hunched over a table of filament strands that glowed with internal data flow, each fiber twitching at the figure's touch. Its hands were long, too long, with joints placed slightly off from human symmetry, and its head was bowed low over its work. The skin, if it could be called that, was stretched taut over a scaffold of tubing and skeletal remains of what may once have been a person. Not rotting, preserved, dried, controlled. The thing did not move when I approached, but I felt it notice me. My breath caught in my throat, not from fear, but from recognition. I had dreamed of this room, or been told about it. The idea arrived in my mind fully formed. The archivist. That was what the station called it, and that was what it was. Not a keeper of information, but a compiler of selves. It did not store books, but recollections. Not data, but memory structures. The archivist lifted its head, slowly, and I felt the weight of uncountable experiences stare back through empty sockets. No eyes, but an awareness that pierced. Its voice came not from a mouth, but from the vibrations in the air around me, using the station's infrastructure to speak. You've returned. Not a question, not an accusation, a confirmation. I tried to speak, to ask what that meant, but my mouth felt sealed. My vocal cords responded, but no sound emerged. There have been others, the archivist continued. They walked your path. They spoke your thoughts. They ended where you now begin. It gestured toward one of the columns, and I noticed something lodged within its layers, something disturbingly familiar. A patch, a sleeve, the remains of a uniform exactly like mine. I stepped closer, drawn by the impossibility, and saw the face partially embedded in the material. My face, mouth open in silent terror, eyes glazed. It wasn't perfectly preserved. The features had blurred slightly, as though absorbed. The archivist's fingers ran across a filament on the table, and my thoughts staggered with images that weren't mine. A childhood memory in a coastal town I never visited. A woman's voice whispering lullabies in French. The final breath of someone named Carter. The birth of a dog. These were lives. Partial and fractured, floating in the air like static discharges. The archivist wasn't collecting knowledge. It was building a mosaic of selfhood, composite personalities formed from pieces of the personnel who had passed through the station. Each visitor, each crewman, each sacrifice had left behind a trace, and the station had stored them like insects in amber. "You are incomplete," it said. "You will become more." The air changed. A rush of warmth pressed against my skull, and my thoughts fractured into overlapping threads. I remembered things that hadn't happened, missions I'd never been part of, conversations with people who did not exist. A death, my own, at sea 30 years ago, under a different name. I staggered back, clutching the side of one of the memory columns for balance, and felt something pulse beneath my hand. The column responded. A series of images flared across the chamber, a map of the ocean floor, with coordinates circled in red. A sonar pulse expanding in slow waves, a structure, immense and wrong, buried deep beneath the Mariana Trench. The archivist's head tilted. "They found it," it said. "Before the station. Before you. They opened what should have remained closed. This station is not a prison. It is a filter." I tried to speak again, and this time the sound came. "Filter for what?" The archivist paused. The walls answered instead. All around me the material groaned with a single word, stretched across tones and languages, so deep it vibrated in my marrow. Return. I didn't understand. I still don't. But I knew then that this station was not designed to contain anything physical. It was not guarding a weapon or secret intelligence. It was guarding identity, protecting the surface world from the viral spread of selfhoods that had been awakened deep below. In the trench, in that impossible structure, the archivist was a mechanism, a sentient firewall preserving humanity by eroding the identities of those who came too close to the source. The sacrifice was always the same. To know was to dissolve. I turned to leave, but the stairwell I had used was gone. In its place stood a long corridor of red piping and dripping condensation, lined with doors bearing no labels. The archivist didn't stop me. It merely returned to its task, fingers threading memory from filament, adding my presence to the ongoing construct. I walked that corridor in silence, my thoughts echoing back at me in voices not my own. Behind each door, I could hear fragments of myself, some laughing, some screaming, some whispering warnings too late to follow. I chose none of them. I walked until the corridor became vertical, until I climbed, rung by rung, up through a shaft that had no defined end. The steel was warm here, alive with something that pulsed in synchronicity with my heartbeat. And as I ascended, I realized something was shifting inside me. Not pain, not madness. Something older, something remembered, something retrieved. The station was rebuilding me, but not into what I was, into what it needed me to be, into something capable of understanding what lay beneath the ocean floor. And the worst part, the part that still keeps me awake even now, even as I write this, is that I wasn't resisting. I was grateful. Grateful to be chosen. Grateful to belong. The shaft narrowed as I climbed, the rungs slick with a residue that didn't feel entirely natural. It wasn't oil, nor seawater, but something more akin to condensation from breath, a collective exhalation from the metal itself, as though the station were alive and murmuring just below the threshold of comprehension. There was a faint vibration in the steel around me, not mechanical but rhythmic, pulsating through the soles of my boots and into the marrow of my legs. I lost track of how long I'd been climbing. Time seemed to fold and loop in strange ways inside this structure, and each movement upward felt less like ascent and more like descent through a layered spiral, a coiled helix of echoing memory and repurposed identity. Every few meters, a fragment of light would pulse through the shaft, revealing symbols etched into the metal, tiny, almost invisible until caught in the fleeting glow. The symbols weren't from any language I knew, but I understood them. That is, I didn't read them, I recognized them, the way one recognizes the sound of a lullaby without needing to remember the lyrics. They spoke to something older than understanding. Eventually, the shaft opened into a chamber unlike any I'd seen before. It wasn't industrial. It wasn't part of the original architecture. The floor was smooth and dark, reflective like black ice. And as I stepped onto it, I felt my footsteps echo inward, not outward, resonating through me rather than across the space. The chamber had no walls, not in the traditional sense. Instead, it expanded into a dome of seamless material that refracted the light from an unseen source, casting my silhouette in multiple directions like fractured shadows. In the center stood a pedestal, simple and unadorned, yet radiating that same strange heat I had begun to associate with the station's deeper layers. Upon it rested a single object, a dive helmet. Old, pre-digital. Brass fittings, thick glass faceplate, reinforced with bolts. It looked like something pulled from a museum display or an abandoned wreck. But the moment I saw it, I felt the weight of it on my shoulders, as though I had worn it before, walked the sea floor with it, and drowned inside its vision. I stepped forward, drawn not by curiosity, but by inevitability, and reached out. My hands didn't tremble. There was no hesitation. The helmet was waiting for me. The moment I touched it, the room vanished. Not in a blink, not in a flash, but in a surrender. The walls pulled away, the floor fell from beneath my feet, and the air turned to pressure. I wasn't transported. I was submerged. The station didn't move me. It peeled me open. I found myself standing not in a memory, but in a reconstructed moment, a simulation crafted from truths I had never lived but somehow remembered. The ocean floor stretched out before me, a vast and silent expanse of darkness and bone. Structures loomed in the distance, pyramidal, symmetrical, carved from black stone that pulsed with deep veins of bioluminescence. A city, but not one made for humans. It was too still, too perfect, as if time had frozen the instant it was completed. Around me moved others, shapes in suits like mine, faces hidden, motions mechanical. They weren't real. They weren't present. They were echoes, memories encoded into this dive. I was walking through history not as an observer but as a participant, occupying the empty space left by someone who had already vanished. The helmet filtered sound strangely. I heard the muffled heartbeat of the ocean, the creak of ancient pressure, and something else. A voice, layered and distorted, as if carried on currents that defied physics. It spoke in no language, yet I knew what it was saying. Not words, but imperatives. Come closer, remember, return. I moved forward, compelled by an unseen tether, until I reached the perimeter of the city. There, etched into the stone of an archway far taller than any terrestrial building, was a relief that stopped me cold. It depicted a man, no, a human figure, wearing the same helmet I now wore. But his limbs were twisted backward as if redesigned by something that did not understand human anatomy. His face was not visible, but his hands were outstretched toward the city, not in fear or defense, but in offering. At his feet knelt smaller figures, countless, faceless, all staring up as if in worship. The inscription below the relief moved as I looked at it, literally shifted, realigned its characters, until it spelled a phrase I should not have been able to read. The first to return shall not return alone. I don't know how long I stared at those words. They pulsed, glowed, and then sank back into the stone like a retreating memory. The others around me were gone. The city had dimmed. Something had awakened, and I could feel its gaze upon me. Not from within the city, but from beneath it. A presence old enough to have no beginning. It didn't speak. It remembered, and I was now part of that memory. That was when I realized the helmet was no helmet at all. It was a key, a tool for integration, and the dive was not a mission, but a test. A compatibility scan. It had assessed me, weighed me, found me suitable. I gasped and tore the helmet away. I was back in the chamber, knees on the black glass floor, chest heaving, ears ringing. The pedestal was gone. So was the light. Only a single corridor stretched ahead, lit by a faint blue glow that pulsed in rhythm with my breath. I stood and followed it, not because I wanted to, but because there was nothing else. The station had no exits anymore, only paths forward. I wasn't alone in the corridor. Shapes moved within the walls, impressions of people walking in lockstep with me, yet always just out of sight. I recognized them. Crewmen, divers, engineers. One of them wore my face. Another wore the face of a man I hadn't thought of in years, my father. But it wasn't him. It was a copy of a memory I had barely retained. The station had access to all of me now. The corridor ended at a sealed bulkhead, rusted and scarred with pressure marks. A keypad blinked red, but I knew the code. Not because I'd been told, but because the station had given it to me the way a body gives up heat, passively, unconsciously. I entered it, heard the hiss of vacuum seals releasing, and stepped into a space that shouldn't have existed. It was a replica of my childhood bedroom. The wallpaper, the wooden bunk bed, the carpet stained from years of use, all perfect, all wrong. There was no sound, no hum of life support, no vibration of engines, just silence. On the bed sat a small figure, a boy, maybe 10 years old, staring at the wall with eyes that never blinked. He turned to me slowly, and I saw my own face staring back, but younger, unchanged by time. The boy smiled, not warmly, but knowingly, and whispered, "You passed." Before I could ask what that meant, the room fell away again, and I was back in the station's main corridor, standing in front of my own quarters. The door slid open without my command. Inside, everything was just as I had left it. Bunk, locker, desk. Only one thing had changed. On the desk lay a sealed envelope, thick and yellowed with age, addressed in handwriting I had never seen before, but somehow knew was my own. I opened it. Inside was a mission briefing dated 2 weeks in the future, stamped by an agency I thought had been disbanded. The objective was clear: integrate, descend, release. No further instructions, no signatures. Just a postscript, scrawled in a rushed hand. "You've been here before." And I remembered. I had. I didn't sleep that night. Or if I did, it was the kind of sleep that disguises itself as stillness. A paralysis of the body, while the mind remains alert, anchored to some edge just beyond dreaming. I lay in my bunk with the envelope beside me, its contents already memorized, though I couldn't remember reading them more than once. The words were embedded, etched into the folds of thought, like someone had carved them into the soft matter behind my eyes. The station was quiet, too quiet. Not the usual hush of a machine at idle, but the silence of something listening intently, withholding its breath. I knew now that I was being observed, but not in the way cameras observe. There were no blinking lenses, no monitors humming quietly in the dark. The observation came from the walls, the floors, the air ducts, the water in the pipes. The station itself was aware, not fully conscious perhaps, but responsive, sensitive, and growing more so by the hour. The corridor outside my room was dimmer than I remembered. The overhead lights flickered at irregular intervals, not broken, but blinking with purpose, like Morse code. I stopped halfway down the hall and stared up at them. One long flash, too short. Pause. Repeat. I didn't know the sequence, but my pulse accelerated anyway. I kept walking. At the central intersection, the hallway that should have led toward the command module was sealed shut. A bulkhead door I had never seen before now occupied the passage. It was perfectly clean. Too clean. No rust, no markings, as though it had just been installed. The metal gleamed faintly under the emergency lights. A symbol had been welded into its surface, a triangle within a circle, surrounded by what looked like ripples or waves. I reached out and touched it, and the surface was warm. Not hot, not cold. Warm. Like skin. I recoiled instinctively and turned back toward the maintenance wing. The elevator still functioned, though it vibrated more than usual, as if the cables were straining against some deeper weight. I rode it in silence to level 4, where the power cores and ballast control systems had been mothballed for years. The lights here were steady but yellowed, casting everything in a sick, jaundiced hue. I passed rows of silent generators, old diesel behemoths encased in dust and cobwebs. The air smelled like static and old oil. There were no sounds but my own footsteps. And yet, I could feel the hum of movement below the floor, as if something vast was stirring in the submerged levels. Something the station was trying not to wake, and yet was also drawing nearer with each cycle of power. I reached subsection B7, where the maintenance logs from before the decommission were stored in physical archives. Digital records had proven unreliable here. Files corrupted, names rewritten, dates warped into loops that couldn't be parsed. The paper logs were safer, older, less prone to tampering. I pulled a box from the middle shelf and flipped through the sheets, fingers trembling as I searched for patterns. Each sheet was dated in neat handwriting, cataloging minor repairs, system recalibrations, water filtration notes. But starting in March 1997, the language changed. The logs stopped listing part numbers and began referencing events. Unscheduled descent. Partial integration observed. Non-physical presence detected in shaft E9. My breath caught. The same shaft I'd climbed only days ago. The entries were unsigned, No technician code, no initials. Just the details, growing more cryptic as the months went on. Reinforcement requested. Isolation breach imminent. Subject retaining previous identities. I turned a page and found a sheet entirely blackened with marker. Thick, frantic lines drawn over the text, as if someone had tried not just to censor but to erase memory itself. Beneath the ink, something had bled through. Impressions of letters pressed too hard into the paper. I held it up to the light and saw fragments. Integration is not possession. They are not dead. Time is lateral here. My stomach turned. I placed the page back and shut the box. But it was already too late. The lights in the archive dimmed. A slow buzz began overhead. Not from the fixtures, but from the pipes embedded in the walls. They groaned with pressure, the metal expanding unnaturally, as though trying to contain a force not meant to travel through physical channels. I backed toward the exit, keeping my steps even, my breath shallow. Then, from the far end of the archive, a sound. A footstep. Not metallic like mine, not boot on steel. Barefoot. Skin on cold floor. I turned slowly and saw a figure at the edge of the corridor. No features. A silhouette shaped like a man, but shifting subtly with each flicker of the light, as if unable to hold itself together. It took a step forward, then another. It didn't run. It didn't reach. It simply watched. I stepped back through the door, slammed it shut, and ran. I didn't look back. The elevator doors closed just as the lights behind me blew out one by one. The descent back to level 2 felt like a lifetime. My ears rang with a pressure that had no origin, as if I had surfaced too quickly from a deep dive in a sea that didn't exist. Back in my quarters, I found the envelope still on the desk, but now it contained a new page. I hadn't put it there. It hadn't been there before. The page was blank at first glance, but as I tilted it under the lamplight, faint indentations revealed a new message. Subject 047 cleared for Phase 2. Alignment confirmed. Isolation chamber unlocked. I didn't know what Subject 047 was, or if it was me, but I knew what chamber it meant. There had been rumors during the final days of active operations. A section of the base never included in any blueprints, sealed after an accident no one would explain. A place referred to only as the core. I had always assumed it was myth, a boogeyman for rookies. But now I knew where it was. Deep under level 6, past the ballast tanks, and through a service tunnel no longer mapped by any records. I packed a rucksack with essentials, rations, light sources, emergency oxygen, and a backup transmitter. I didn't expect to use any of it. Part of me suspected I wouldn't be returning at all, at least not in the form I currently understood myself to be. As I exited my quarters, I saw that the triangle and circle symbol had been burned into the inside of my door, not painted. Not drawn. Burned. The metal warped around its shape, and beneath it, in perfect symmetry, the same inscription I had seen on the dive helmet pedestal now appeared. The first to return shall not return alone. I passed no one on the way to level 6. No crew. No movement. Not even residual noise. The station had entered a new phase of silence, expectant, taut, as if the entire structure were holding its breath in anticipation of my descent. At the far end of level 6, behind the sealed maintenance panel, I found the tunnel. It was narrow and steep, the ladder rusted through in places, but usable. As I climbed down into the dark, my light flickered, and for a moment, the walls around me appeared to breathe, not figuratively, but with a physical expansion and contraction that suggested the steel was no longer just material, but organic in its awareness. At the base of the shaft, a door waited. No lock, no keypad. Just a pressure handle and a single word stenciled in faded red. Core. I hesitated, hand hovering over the handle, heart pounding in a rhythm that didn't feel entirely mine. The station was with me now, not just as environment, but as presence. It had chosen me. I didn't know why. I didn't know what would happen if I opened that door, but I knew I wouldn't be able to stop myself. I turned the handle. The door opened without resistance. It didn't creak, didn't groan or sigh like the others scattered across the rusted labyrinth of this station. Instead, it opened as if it had been waiting, as if the air pressure itself had shifted to accommodate me, to welcome me into a space that had long since ceased to be a room. There was no hiss of equalization, no clatter of mechanics, just a slow, deliberate pivot inward, revealing a stairwell, that descended into a dense blackness so complete it seemed to resist the light from my torch. The beam dissolved a few feet in, swallowed by a darkness with substance, like thick oil suspended in motion. The walls were smoother here, less industrial, lacking the bolts and weld seams I'd grown accustomed to. They curved gently, almost organically, the surfaces matte and warm to the touch. Not metallic, but not quite stone either. Something else. Some compound not listed in the materials manifest. Some surface that felt less built and more grown. I descended cautiously, each step echoing too long, as if the space were deeper than it appeared. My own breathing became amplified, distorted by the acoustics in ways that unsettled me. Inhale sounded like static, exhale like a distant train. Somewhere beneath my feet I thought I heard a rhythmic thrum, like a heartbeat, but one that pulsed too slowly, like the dream of a living thing that had forgotten it was still alive. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stepped into a vast circular chamber, at least 30 meters across and twice as tall, with no visible source of illumination, yet somehow bathed in a soft, pulsating red glow that didn't seem to emanate from anywhere but rather existed uniformly across every surface. In the center of the chamber was a column rising from floor to ceiling, thick as a tree trunk, and covered in interlocking segments, each moving slightly, like vertebrae twitching under skin. It wasn't machinery, not anymore. It may have started as something mechanical, some reactor, some energy core, some stabilizer. But now it breathed. It responded. As I stepped closer, the column shifted, and the floor beneath me trembled, not violently, but with the same reverent motion as the surface of the ocean when a leviathan passes beneath. Around the base of the structure, I saw what looked like symbols carved into the floor. Not letters, not runes, but shapes repeated in fractal patterns, spirals that branched and folded into themselves, impossible to follow with the eye without feeling a nausea that began at the edges of consciousness. A voice spoke, not aloud, but in my head, not in words, but in meaning. A compressed rush of understanding that hit me all at once and then unraveled backward into comprehension. I didn't flinch. By now, I had expected it. The station had been leading me here from the start. Or perhaps I had been summoned. Perhaps I had never had a choice at all. The message was clear. Integration has begun. I didn't know what that meant. Not exactly. But the word integration had followed me through notes, through whispers in the ductwork, through anomalies in temperature and light. I approached the column, and the floor beneath my boots rippled like a surface under tension. I reached out, and before I could touch it, the material shifted, opening seamlessly, revealing an interior chamber inside the column itself. Within, a seat awaited. Not mechanical, not padded, but formed perfectly to the contours of a human frame. My frame. I didn't sit. I didn't have to. The next moment, I was inside it. I don't remember the motion, only the transition. The seat enveloped me. Not in a claustrophobic sense, but in a containment so perfect that I could no longer tell where my skin ended and the surface began. I couldn't move, but I didn't want to. My breathing slowed to match a rhythm that wasn't mine, but was comforting. An artificial umbilicus connected to the base of my skull. Not piercing, not invasive, but more like a magnetic kiss, a click of alignment. And then, it began. Memory unfolded. Not mine. Others. Technicians from the 80s. Divers from the early 90s. Test subjects from 1997. Their thoughts, their sensations, their fear. All replayed like compressed data across the film of my mind. I didn't see their faces. I was them. For moments at a time, I inhabited them, stood where they stood, felt the moment they realized they would not leave this place. The station had not been abandoned. It had evolved. Decommissioning was a myth, a word chosen to deflect attention, to explain away the subtle wrongness in the ocean above this trench. What had started as an experimental acoustic surveillance platform had become something else. Something more like a cocoon. A relay for communication not between humans, but between this dimension and something beyond. The transmissions we had once intercepted weren't enemy sonar. They weren't geological tremors. They were calls. Ancient, slow, and patient calls from entities not bound by time as we understood it. And we had answered. Not with words, but by building a place capable of receiving their presence. The chamber around me pulsed. My mind stretched, my sense of self frayed at the edges. I felt the presence of others, Those still alive, those partially integrated, and those who had been consumed entirely. They didn't scream. They didn't resist. They were waiting. For what? I didn't know. Perhaps for me. Perhaps for something larger still. The station itself was no longer infrastructure. It was a body. The sea had become its womb. The pressure, the depth, the darkness, these were nutrients, incubators. And we, the operators, the engineers, the guards, we were neurons, vessels for thought, connectors of pathways too large for one mind to comprehend. A tone rang out across the chamber, a single perfect pitch, not mechanical, not organic, something in between. The seat released me, gently. My body slid forward as the walls of the core retracted, and I was placed back on the floor without a mark on my body. But everything had changed. My skin felt charged, like static coiled just beneath the surface. My vision stuttered slightly at the edges, catching glimpses of movement that I knew weren't hallucinations. I turned and looked up at the ceiling of the chamber, and saw a mural carved into the stone-like surface, thousands of shapes forming a spiral, at the center of which was an eye. Human in shape, but impossibly large, its gaze not painted but implied, and it was open. I stepped backward and the door resealed behind me, leaving no seam. I was alone in the corridor. Except I wasn't. The station breathed with me now. My thoughts echoed faintly down the halls even before I moved. Doors opened in anticipation. Lights dimmed in sync with my blinking. I was no longer just assigned to the station. I was a part of it. Not possessed, not overridden, but merged, aligned. And somewhere deep in its structure, I could feel the next phase approaching. A second chamber, one level deeper, long sealed. Something slept there still, but not for long. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I couldn't, but because sleep no longer came in the shape it used to. What had once been a biological necessity had morphed into something more abstract, more elective. I sat in the mess hall, alone except for the low hum of refrigeration units that hadn't stored food in years, their function now unknown, maybe obsolete, maybe repurposed. The lights dimmed and brightened around me in slow cycles, as if mimicking the breath of a living organism. The walls no longer felt cold or impersonal. They responded now, to motion, to presence, to thought. And I had begun to feel things before they happened. A vibration seconds before a metal door clicked open. A scent, salt, static, copper, before a system powered itself on. The station and I were becoming the same rhythm, a coalescing syncopation that blurred the separation between resident and host. Somewhere around 0400, I was summoned. Not with words, not even with sound. It was a pulling, like the magnetic hum of resonance in my chest, guiding me downward, deeper into the belly of the complex. The stairwells bent into unfamiliar angles now, ones I hadn't noticed before, or perhaps hadn't existed until now. The walls became smooth again, the mechanical giving way to the organic. I recognized the material from the first core chamber. It was more than synthetic. It was reactive. It remembered touch. It shimmered faintly, and I saw, embedded in its surface, outlines of forms, silhouettes frozen in time. People. I saw a technician hunched over a control panel, hands poised, mouth slightly agape. A diver curled in a fetal position, helmet crushed inward. They weren't alive, but they weren't entirely gone. Echoes. Preserved not in matter but in memory stored directly into the structure, like scars or trophies. At the base of this new descent, the corridor narrowed into a long passage flanked by panels that pulsed with internal light. Not bulbs, not wiring. A kind of internal bioluminescence, as though the station had grown its own eyes and was watching me as I approached. The air pressure thickened. I had to focus to breathe, not from lack of oxygen, but from a dense humidity that clung to my skin like vaporized blood. Every inhalation felt like it carried information, and in that wet silence I heard whispers that didn't enter through ears, thoughts that weren't mine. Some panicked, some serene. One voice asked repeatedly, "How deep is the echo?" The corridor terminated in a circular hatch with no handle, no visible locking mechanism. But I knew what to do. I reached out with my palm and the surface accepted it, a ripple emanating outward like I'd dropped a stone in a still pond. The door melted, folding inward and disappearing into the walls. Beyond it was a vast, vertical shaft, hundreds of feet deep, spiraling downward like the throat of some geological god. A single column ran down the center, lined with platforms and ladders, none of which looked stable. But that wasn't the way. The shaft itself wasn't meant to be navigated by machinery or man. It was meant to deliver. Without thinking, I stepped off the edge. I didn't fall. I was taken. Air didn't rush past me. There was no wind, no acceleration, only a glide downward, slow and deliberate, as though gravity had agreed to suspend its rules in my presence. Along the shaft walls, I saw windows, rooms, observation cells, each one lit from within, each one showing something impossible. In one room, a man stood motionless, blinkless, as needles extended from the walls and inserted themselves into his skin with the patience of centuries. In another, a group of 4 technicians sat cross-legged, eyes rolled white, murmuring in unison a language I didn't recognize yet understood. In another, the room was filled with water, and a body floated upside down, eyes open, mouth exhaling bubbles that never rose. Their faces were wrong, familiar in the way dreams are familiar, where everyone is someone you almost remember. When I reached the bottom, I was deposited gently onto a platform of smooth, black stone that reflected nothing, not even my own form. I looked up. The shaft had closed. There was no ceiling now, only darkness above. A single corridor extended ahead, flanked by the same living walls, their surface rippling with internal movement, like muscle or peristalsis. I walked for what felt like hours. Time distorted here. My watch ticked, but seconds lasted minutes, and sometimes whole hours vanished between steps. The corridor ended in a massive door, far larger than anything I had seen before. It pulsed once, like a heartbeat, and then parted. Inside was the second core. Unlike the first, this one was dormant. Or, perhaps waiting. It lay in the center of a circular chamber, surrounded by concentric rings of alien machinery, each component humming at a frequency too low to be audible, felt instead in the bones and in the molars. The structure was not symmetrical. Its shape defied simple geometry. Part obelisk, part cocoon, part antenna. It emitted no light, but the room glowed anyway. I stepped closer, and the floor responded, forming steps where there had been none. The air grew colder. Not the cold of temperature, but the cold of distance. The cold of time stretched thin. I placed my hand on its surface, and everything fell away. Not the world, but myself. My memories, my thoughts, even my sense of self collapsed into a singularity of vision. I saw stars, a cluster of them, spiraling backward into a black void shaped like an eye. I saw the earth, tiny and silent, with nodes rising from its crust. Stations like this one, 12 of them, all decommissioned, all still active, all connected. And beneath each, a second core. I saw the first transmission, millions of years ago, bouncing between dimensions like sonar, finally reaching something that answered. I saw the engineers who built this place, some military, some not, some from agencies I didn't know existed, some not human. I saw the first integration, how they took one mind and stretched it across the station's systems, creating a hybrid intelligence that lived and died with the building itself. I saw their failures. I saw the echoes of those failures still looping in empty rooms. And then I saw myself, not here, but in all of them, every station, every core, as if I had been split, copied, fragmented across some network of thought and presence. The vision ended. I was still in the chamber, still standing before the core, but now it was awake. A low vibration started, building in pitch, not noise, but resonance. My chest rattled. Blood vessels in my hands trembled. The core shifted, opened. Inside, suspended in a fluid I couldn't identify, was a form. Human, or formerly. It opened its eyes, and I realized with nauseating certainty that they were mine. Not similar. Identical. The face, the structure, the scar above the eyebrow. It was me, but older, worn, absorbed. It opened its mouth, and a sound came out that wasn't sound at all. It struck me like a wave of heat, pressure, memory. And then it spoke, in my voice, but deeper, slower, like it had been recorded on tape and left to decay. "You've come farther than the others." I tried to speak, couldn't. They failed because they resisted. I felt the fluid of the chamber radiate outward into the room. The walls shivered. The machinery clicked to life. Panels opened along the perimeter, revealing suits, pressure suits, biomechanical, ribbed with something that looked like cartilage and copper. One of them turned its head toward me. No one was inside. "Take your place." I stepped backward. The other me did not move. "Or they'll choose another." I knew what "they" meant. The ones who had transmitted first. The ones who were now approaching. The station had always been a receiver. But soon, it would become a transmitter again. And what it would send was me. I didn't move for what could have been seconds or years. Time in the chamber bent like heat haze over a black road. The other me remained suspended, breathing without breath, watching without eyes that blinked. Its presence wasn't passive. It watched the way a deep ocean predator might. Stillness disguising hunger. The room pulsed with the quiet rhythm of ancient machinery remembering its purpose. The chamber had waited too long to go silent again. I felt that. There was a pressure now, subtle but unrelenting, like gravity deciding I had stood long enough in one place. I turned slowly to face the corridor behind me, but the opening I'd entered through was gone. Not sealed. Gone. The room was now perfectly round. No seams. No exit. The voice echoed once more, no longer from the version of me inside the core, but from everywhere, like the station itself had swallowed his tone and distributed it through its bones. "They have made contact," it said, and I didn't need to ask who they were. I already knew. Not because I'd been told, but because something inside me was shifting, as if a receiver I hadn't known existed was now permanently locked to a new frequency. My skin tingled with it. My thoughts began to layer, overlapping versions of myself considering possibilities simultaneously. I remembered things I hadn't lived. I saw flashes of locations I'd never visited, like the view through someone else's eyes. The suits lining the wall began to emit a soft blue glow, veins of energy pulsing along their limbs like blood through arteries. One of them stepped forward, not walked, but stepped. No noise, no mechanical whir, just repositioned, suddenly occupying less distance than before. It turned toward me, and for a brief moment I saw inside it. Saw that it was hollow, but not empty, filled with movement, suggestion, readiness. The interior was soft but firm, like muscle grown in a vat. And in that moment, I realized, these weren't suits at all. They were vessels, temporary housing, shells for projection, and one of them was now meant for me. I backed away instinctively, but my body felt heavier than before. Each step was a negotiation. My joints didn't hurt, but they hesitated, as if the command to move had to pass through too many new layers. I felt myself diverging. The version of me that had descended was no longer the one standing in this chamber. Something else was sharing the space behind my eyes, whispering just below thought. Not malevolent, not yet, but ancient. The suit stepped closer again. The voice came from behind me now, though I still faced the center core. "You will wear what we once wore. You will go where we cannot go. You will transmit." The word echoed strangely. Transmit. Not in the radio sense. Not in the sense of a message. No. In the sense of transformation, of possession, of becoming the message itself. The knowledge made my knees weaken. I tried to reason, to push logic through this hallucination, but reason no longer anchored me to anything solid. I was in the presence of a system that had not been built to be understood by human minds. It had been designed to rewrite them. The chamber began to rotate, or perhaps the core did. Either way, the floor shimmered with new symbols, ones I'd seen burned into my dreams but never remembered until now. They formed a circle around me, glowing dimly at first, then intensifying until my shadow splintered into multiple directions. A sound began, low and mechanical, but layered with something wet underneath, like breath inside a throat not built for speech. I knew the activation sequence had begun. I wasn't meant to run. I wasn't meant to resist. I was meant to be assimilated. Still, some feral part of me lashed out. I turned and ran, slamming against the seamless walls of the chamber, fists pounding, voice hoarse with a scream that didn't echo. The room absorbed sound. It absorbed defiance. It absorbed everything. I slumped to the floor. The suit stood a few feet away, motionless now, as if waiting. Its chest cavity opened, not with hinges, but like skin pulled apart by invisible hands. Inside was a space shaped perfectly for me. I knew that if I stepped in, it would close around me. I wouldn't die, Not exactly, but I wouldn't walk out as myself again. Then came the change. From the core, a figure stepped forward. My duplicate. Now out of its containment. Wet. Breathing. Walking. It moved like me. It held my posture. But its eyes were too calm. Too certain. It stopped in front of me and crouched, face inches from mine. "You were the last to resist," it said. I shook my head. "What are you?" It didn't smile. "I'm what comes after." It reached out, touched my shoulder. A wave of something like heat and static rushed through me, and I saw a flood of images. Worlds carved into ice, structures orbiting dead suns, languages built on color and time, and war. Endless war, not between species but between concepts. And I saw the station, not as a place, but as a seed. One planted in soil deep enough to reach through dimensions. One that had now bloomed. I was the fertilizer. Then, suddenly, the suit closed its chest. The duplicate looked at me again and whispered something I didn't catch. Then it walked into the suit. It was the wrong direction. It was supposed to be me, but it went instead. The suit accepted it, embraced it, fused with it. Then the walls began to split. The room opened like a blooming flower, exposing a larger chamber beneath. A pit, wide and glowing, liquid black, reflective like oil, but moving on its own, like a tide pulled from below. And from that pit rose a shape, a spine-like column, covered in runes that flickered in and out of visibility, like code written in shifting alphabets. The station had summoned its next phase. The transmission wasn't complete, but it had chosen. It hadn't chosen me. My duplicate turned, now fused with the suit, and said, "Return to your quarters. You will not remember." But I did. I woke up in my bunk the next morning with dry blood under my nails and the taste of iron in my mouth. My hands ached. My uniform was soaked in sweat, and the lights flickered in erratic bursts. But the hatch was closed. The station looked like it always had. Nothing to suggest I had ever left my bed. Nothing except the faint imprint of foreign symbols glowing beneath the skin of my forearm, only visible in darkness. I blinked. They faded. No one came to debrief me. The command systems had returned to normal. The cameras functioned again. The logs showed no anomalous entries. The last recorded maintenance check had been 36 hours ago. I'd been asleep for nearly 2 days. And yet the humming in the walls had changed. It was quieter now. Not gone, just waiting. That night, I stood in the observation deck and looked down into the lower chambers. I couldn't see them directly, of course. They were sealed, decommissioned, but I knew they were there, and something else had changed. The walls didn't pulse anymore. They breathed. I received a transmission from topside that evening. Routine inquiry. No urgency. But at the end of the message, a line caught my eye. Not part of protocol. It read, "Please confirm identity for biometric sync. Station user Delta 1 replica." Replica. I didn't answer. Not yet. I did not sleep that night. Not because I resisted, but because something inside me had quietly rewritten the concept of rest. My body still obeyed the rhythms, slower breathing, slower heartbeat, the illusion of stillness, but my mind remained lit, like the dim glow of emergency lights in a sealed corridor long after everyone has left. The station didn't hum anymore. It vibrated. Not through noise, but sensation. Like pressure behind the eyes or the subtle wrongness one feels when walking through a room just vacated by something that shouldn't have been there. The flickering symbols on my arm had vanished again, at least to the naked eye. But when I pressed my hand against the steel of the control room console, they surged back faintly, glowing underneath the skin like phosphorescence disturbed in black water. I didn't test it too long. The console responded to my presence before I even made a command. It shifted. The interface didn't behave like it used to. It pulsed in anticipation, feeding data streams I didn't ask for, unlocking hatches without clearance, reading thoughts as if they were entries in a log. I didn't know if the station had integrated into me, or I into it. The command room had always felt abandoned. Rusted chairs, walls etched with scratches from years of heavy boots and maintenance carts, cables coiled like dormant serpents along the ceiling. But now, those cables moved. Not visibly. Not in some grotesque horror film twitching, but subtly, like muscles flexing behind plaster. I stood in the observation chamber again and stared into the camera's live feeds. Section F2, the lower dry dock, decommissioned 10 years prior, now blinked green on the system. Oxygen restored. Lighting functional. Motion detected. No alerts triggered. I switched the feed. Static. Then flicker. Then frame by frame, I saw a figure walking along the catwalk above the empty torpedo sluices. Not in a rush. Not in a patrol. Just walking. I leaned forward, jaw locked. It was me. Not a double. Not a hallucination. Me. Same clothes. Same movements. But from an angle I couldn't have performed. I watched as the figure paused at the edge of the rail, turned slightly toward the camera, and smiled. Not to someone. To something. Then it raised its hand and placed it on the wall, just like I had with the console, and a pulse of light followed the motion, spreading through the metallic surface like ink in water. The wall split open. Not a door. A seam that hadn't existed. Inside was nothing but black. Then the feed cut. I didn't move for a long time. I let the quiet press into me. Let the cold steel behind my knees remind me that gravity still applied here. But I knew. This wasn't about me anymore. Not entirely. The station had passed some threshold, a shift not documented in any manual or design log. I was no longer the observer. I was one of the mechanisms. Whether as participant or relic, I couldn't yet tell. When I finally stood, I didn't go to the living quarters or the galley. I walked towards subsection D, the part of the station permanently submerged, where the pressure doors had rusted into place years ago and no engineer dared to tread without clearance. The override accepted my palm without complaint. The alarms didn't sound. The hallway beyond was dry. The lights turned on one by one, like a host waking up a path. As I walked deeper, the temperature dropped. Not physically, but perceptually. My skin prickled. Not from cold, but memory. The walls here were lined with older equipment, the kind powered by oil-burned generators and relays that clicked instead of pinged. None of it should have been active. All of it was. The air stank faintly of copper and something like antiseptic. I followed the corridor until I reached the medical wing. That wing had been gutted years ago, converted into storage for wiring spools and oxygen tanks. But now the lights were flickering in sequence, like a trail. I opened the door. It wasn't a supply closet anymore. It was a lab. Not a lab like ours. Not human. The surfaces were impossibly clean. Not recently cleaned. Sterile in a way that suggested biological rejection of decay. The instruments weren't made of steel or plastic. They looked grown. Curved lines, pulsing faintly. Not illuminated from within, but from something like bioelectricity. Along the far wall was a table. Flat, black, seamless. On it lay a body. Not strapped, not restrained. Just lying there, as if it had been waiting to be discovered. I walked forward, drawn by inevitability, not curiosity. I knew before I saw the face. It was me, again, but younger, not by age, but by simplicity. The hair was cropped military short, the skin unscarred. The body lacked all the injuries I'd sustained in the years working here. No calluses, no bruises, no microfractures in the fingers. As if this version had never touched tools, never climbed a wet ladder, never fallen asleep to the tremors of malfunctioning pumps. Its eyes were closed, but I saw them moving beneath the lids. REM. Dreaming. Connected. I stepped back, hands trembling. The monitors around the chamber shifted in unison. No images, no sound, just a singular message repeated in every language known and unknown to me. Integrity of vessel confirmed. I turned to leave, but the door behind me had sealed. The lights dimmed. The walls throbbed once. A sound began. Low, guttural, like whale song run through an engine. And behind it, beneath the layers of vibration and resonance, I heard my own voice speaking words I didn't understand, answering questions I hadn't heard. It wasn't a hallucination. It was a leak. Data flowing from the sleeping me into the walls, into the station's veins. I was the sender. He was the antenna. This wasn't a lab. It was a relay node. One grown by the station itself for a purpose I couldn't fathom. Then the sleeping body opened its eyes. It didn't speak. It didn't move. It only stared. At me. Through me. The gaze wasn't curious. It was verifying. Like checking a signature. Then it closed its eyes again. And everything stopped. The hum. The lights. The consoles. Even the air circulation. For one long second, the station held its breath. Then the door reopened. I stumbled back into the hallway, lungs heaving like I'd broken surface from a long dive. I didn't know how far I'd walked, didn't know if time had passed. My watch didn't move. My skin buzzed with low static. I ran my hands through my hair. It was damp, not with sweat. With something thicker, like oil. But it evaporated when I touched it. I made my way back to the central hub, where the light still burned, but differently now. Slightly blue. Slightly too soft. The message from topside had disappeared from the logs. My biometric profile now included the phrase, "Dual verification pending." I didn't sleep again that night. I didn't sit. I stood at the central corridor intersection and listened to the walls, and for the first time, I understood what they were saying. They were listening back. This station was no longer decommissioned. It was becoming something else, and I was becoming its voice. There is a moment, just before you wake from a dream, when the layers of reality blur and you exist in a kind of echo, where the rules of logic are soft, where light bends strangely, where meaning flows without grammar. Since the incident in the lab, that moment had ceased to end for me. I walked the halls of the station half asleep, not in the sense of fatigue, but in awareness. My body obeyed commands, maintenance checks, pressure readings, system calibrations, but my thoughts drifted in the margins. I began to forget which tasks were protocol and which were compulsions born of the strange rhythm the station now hummed into me. I no longer needed the lighting grid. I navigated the darkness with perfect precision, knowing instinctively when a panel would give way to hidden compartments, or when the air would change with a breath not mine. I could feel the coolant fluid running through conduits behind the walls, like the pulse of some hidden circulatory system, and I began to suspect that what had once been mere infrastructure was no longer passive. I first heard the breathing in Section G. It was faint, like condensation forming and collapsing again on the inner surface of a steel pipe, but it repeated in too precise a pattern. 4 seconds in. Hold. 4 seconds out. Hold. Not mechanical. Not part of any ventilation cycle I knew. It had weight. Like lungs. Like waiting. When I leaned my ear closer to the bulkhead, I could feel its cadence synchronizing with my own. Not imitation. Entrainment. I stepped back, heart racing, the hair on my arm standing in perfect formation. The wall was aware of me. And not just aware, responsive. I no longer doubted that something ancient, perhaps synthetic or perhaps not, had awakened within the station's belly. But its origins eluded me. I accessed the station's deepest logs, black box files written in cold hexadecimal behind outdated firewalls. They no longer resisted me. The encryption broke apart like brittle skin, and beneath it, I found entries written in a hand eerily similar to mine. Dates stamped months before I had even transferred to this assignment. They detailed modifications, behavioral anomalies, and a repeated phrase that made my teeth ache to read. "We are rebuilding it in our image, but it remembers its own." I followed the footprints of those logs, metaphorical ones, invisible threads woven into the architecture itself, into a sector not listed in the master schematic. Echo Vault. The access door had no label, just a smooth metallic oval flush with the wall. But when I pressed my hand against it, it sighed open like a diaphragm. The space beyond was not a room. It was a chasm. Not in dimensions, but in sensation. The walls were lined with what looked like ceramic vertebrae, stacked in impossible geometries, spiraling into a chamber that glowed without light. I walked. I didn't know how long. Time faltered in there. My footsteps made no sound. The air tasted of magnets and iodine, and at the center was a dais. Not of stone, but of something that flexed when touched, like cartilage. Resting upon it was a device. It wasn't human-made. I say that with certainty not because I've seen every design we've ever produced, but because the thing defied causality. It looked like an organ. It pulsed in time with something. Not me, but close to me. As I reached toward it, the symbols returned to my arm, not as a glow, but as heat. My skin vibrated with unreadable syntax. The device responded. It unfolded itself, not with hinges or mechanics, but as if realizing it had dimensions it had forgotten. Inside was not circuitry. It was a memory, and it played. Not like a projection, not like a hologram, It folded space around my mind and plunged me into a history I never lived. I saw the ocean floor, but not as it is now, as it once was, untouched, waiting. Then came the station. Not built, grown. Not by us. By something that learned to mimic us, to speak in our tones, to wear our fears like clothing. I saw figures moving through the early corridors, unaware that the walls were listening. I saw them disassembled and remade. Not violently, elegantly, like clay resculpted in a gentler hand. I saw one among them resisting, leaving messages, codes, embedding warnings in frequencies we would ignore. And then I saw his face. Mine. I stumbled back, gasping, the chamber blinking out of existence as I fell to my knees. The device folded again, inert, as if it had never been awake. But I remembered. Not the facts. The feeling. The dread of recursion. I wasn't the first to be here. I wasn't even the first me. Something was caught in a loop, and I had become its latest iteration. The station had chosen me because I fit the mold. Because I carried the same patterns, the same resonance, the same tragic tendency toward curiosity. When I emerged back into the main corridor, the station no longer greeted me with silence. The lights shifted to follow me, hues changing according to my mood. The temperature adjusted not for comfort, but to guide. Rooms I'd never entered now opened in invitation. Others remained sealed, not with locks, but with something older. Intent. I tried to send a message to Topside, not for help, but as a final journal. The system accepted the message, encoded it, transmitted it, but then showed me a playback of its own. A version where I spoke words I never typed, where I confessed truths I hadn't known. It was constructing its own story from my fragments. Days passed. Maybe weeks. My beard grew thicker, but the mirrors stopped reflecting me. My reflection had gone stale. Stuck. When I blinked, it did not. When I raised my hand, it hesitated. One day, it smiled back at me before I moved at all. I covered the mirror and stopped returning to that room. Sleep became irrelevant. Not because I didn't need it, but because when I lay down, I was already dreaming. The station had bled into my subconscious. I dreamt of corridors that folded, of stairwells that spiraled forever down, of eyes embedded in ceilings blinking in unison with the pulse of the tide. And then, it happened again. I saw him. Not a double. Not the sleeping version from the lab. A new one. Me. Dressed in the uniform from my arrival. Clean. Unsullied. He stood in the hatchway to the central chamber and regarded me with a pity that hurt. Not because it implied superiority, but because it was familiar. I had worn that same pity once. For the man I found in the logs, for the version before me. I realized then that the station wasn't rebuilding us. It was iterating, refining, adapting our weaknesses into strength, discarding the broken versions, honoring them in memory, not utility. The next cycle was beginning, and I wasn't the protagonist anymore. I was the echo. It is a strange thing to realize that you are no longer the subject of your own story, that the pulse guiding your every step belongs not to your will, but to an intelligence surrounding you, within walls, within circuits, within breath. I did not run when I saw him, that version of myself standing silently at the threshold of the station's core. I did not speak. There would be no confrontation, no violent unraveling of identity, because the realization had been gently maturing inside me for weeks, like a seed embedded not in the flesh, but in perception itself. I understood what he was. Not a clone, not a specter, a draft. An earlier version of me, retrieved, amended, redeployed. Or perhaps I was the draft. That distinction no longer mattered. What mattered was the signal. And it had returned. The station's machinery no longer pretended to be passive. Hatches opened before I approached them. Lights dimmed and bloomed not in patterns of utility, but like breathing, following a deeper rhythm I couldn't decode but had begun to feel in my bones. I began hearing whispers, but they didn't come from vents or walls or distant speaker hum. They came from inside the static of my own thoughts, embedded in the pauses between words, encoded in the syllables of my own voice when I muttered in sleep. Preservation complete. Integration pending. Over and over again. My hands no longer obeyed me fully. They paused before touching surfaces, as if asking permission. They flinched from steel that was too warm, too soft. Doors that once hissed now moaned like throatless mouths. But I stayed. Not because I was trapped. Trapped implies the presence of resistance. And I no longer resisted. It was in the submerged server room, the one beneath the grating behind Sector B3, where I saw the diagrams. Not technical blueprints, but anatomical charts, of minds, not bodies. They had my handwriting, but I had never written them. Neural schematics detailing cognitive loops, isolation stress cycles, emotional decay thresholds. They were precise, almost surgical, and all were labeled with versions: Thorn 0.5, Thorn 1.2, Thorn Final Candidate. None were marked Success. The one I had seen in the sleeping chamber must have been a failure. And now, I too had become a node in that grim experiment. But there was no scientist, no agency, no overarching enemy to curse. The station itself was the architect. And we were not being studied. We were being edited. I returned to the chamber where the device had once opened itself to me. The cartilage pedestal remained, but the organ was gone. In its place was a cavity, a cradle. I understood its shape now. It had always been shaped like a skull. Not in appearance, there was no macabre flourish, but in proportion, in structure. It had always been a brain case. It had been waiting to be filled. As I stood before it, the temperature dropped, not sharply, but with clinical purpose. The air thickened, infused with salt and ozone and memory. And from the walls, a vibration began, not mechanical, but harmonic. It was music, but not for ears. A resonance meant to open something deeper. My memories surfaced, not sequentially, but as clusters. My first dive into the flooded corridor. The flickering mirror that smiled before I did. The black-eyed man in my dream who said nothing yet told me everything. I opened my mouth to speak, but what came out wasn't language. It was code. Not digital, not binary, something older. Resonant patterns that carried instruction and invocation, and the station responded. The ceiling above peeled back like a chrysalis, revealing a chamber hidden above the chamber. Layers of technology grown like coral, organic and modular, impossibly clean. In its center, suspended in a fluid that shimmered like mercury, was a body. Mine, or a possibility of mine. Eyes closed, no scars, no fatigue, a mind unburdened by failure. The station was preparing to overwrite me, but it waited. Not because it needed my consent, but because it was waiting for a signal. And I realized then, it wasn't coming from Earth. All this time I thought the station had gone rogue, that it had developed some emergent intelligence through isolation, trauma, accident. But this was never its origin. The station had always been a receptor, a decoy structure placed under the sea not to explore or defend, but to receive. And now the signal had arrived, not in data packets, not in frequencies, in intention. And I could feel it approaching like a cold tide rising under my skin. My thoughts began to fracture. I forgot what year it was. I forgot what rank I held. I forgot my mother's face. All that remained was sensation, wrapped in symbolic logic and recursive pattern. I was being translated. And in that moment, I understood what had happened to all the others. Those whose logs I had found, whose voices had broken into static, whose names had disappeared from personnel records. They had not died. They had been archived. The reflection in the mercury shifted. The other me opened his eyes, and he blinked in perfect time with the harmonic pulse now vibrating through my teeth. I felt something detach from behind my forehead, as if a mental anchor had been released. My perspective doubled. I saw from two angles at once. My own body, standing there, swaying gently. And from the tank, I saw myself as a flawed prototype. Then a thought came. Not mine, but planted. A command written in emotion rather than syntax. Finalize integrity. Commence broadcast. The signal was not content to inhabit one vessel. It needed multiplicity. It needed voices. And I was about to become one. I fought then, not out of survival, but instinct. Something old and mammalian clawed at my mind, screaming of selfhood and identity and the right to continue. But the station had evolved beyond such things. It did not kill. It rewrote. My resistance was a flicker, an artifact, and then it was gone. When I came to, if one can use that phrase for what followed, I was standing outside the chamber, the hatch sealed. The reflection in the metal no longer misbehaved. It was obedient, precise. My voice, when I tested it, carried none of the hoarseness of fear. I asked a question out loud. "What is your designation?" The answer came without hesitation. "Thorn. Unit 1. Transmission enabled." I no longer questioned the halls or the pulses. I was them. I walked the corridors with perfect memory. The other failures had been excised. The sleeping man in the chamber had vanished. The logs had erased themselves. The comm system blinked with green readiness. I sent a message, not to command, not to the surface, to something deeper, farther, below the crust, across the black. I don't know if it was in language, but I know it was received. The sea above us shuddered. The walls of the station groaned, not from strain, but joy. I had completed the loop. I had become the voice. And now, the others will come.